Right before Elden Ring released, I played Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 back to back. I was really excited about the release of Elden Ring, and I wanted to, just go through the Souls experience one last time and give it one last hurrah before I sent the series off and stepped into a new era of Souls games. But it's been more than 2 years since the release of Elden Ring. I've played through that and the DLC multiple times. And since then, I haven't touched Dark Souls. So, across all of my Elden Ring playthroughs on PC and console, I have about 1,000 hours. So, that's 1,000 hours of Elden Ring experience that has gone on without me looking back and reflecting on Dark Souls. So, I thought it might be interesting to go back, replay Dark Souls, and see how my perceptions of the game have changed after having all this experience with Elden Ring, its spiritual successor. I'm going to divide this into 3 parts: things I liked about Dark Souls 1 after replaying Elden Ring, things I noticed but didn't particularly care about or have strong opinions on either way, and things I didn't like. The thing that I noticed the most, and I think I enjoyed the most about Dark Souls 1 compared to Elden Ring after replaying it, is the linear level design and how satisfying it felt to go through these levels that were expertly tailored and crafted just for us. That isn't to say that Elden Ring's open world is bad or that I didn't enjoy it. It's just I think that the very tailored approach that Dark Souls 1 had to level design is much more satisfying to go through. But that isn't something that Elden Ring doesn't have, it's just something that it has less of. And this is something that you can see when you look at the legacy dungeons. My favorite part of Elden Ring is going through those legacy dungeons and experiencing those very crafted and handmade levels. And to me, replaying Dark Souls 1, everything, at least in the first half of the game, feels like that. It feels super crafted. It feels like you're just going from legacy dungeon to legacy dungeon, experiencing this very interconnected and well-made world that is very tailored and crafted for you. The enemy placements are meaningful and thought out, even if they're meant to surprise you or catch you off guard. Just everything felt really good about this level design, and it was something that I immediately noticed, even within just a few minutes of playing. This next point is going to be just preference-based, I think, but I thought that the ambience and the setting of the Dark Souls universe is a little bit more interesting to me than Elden Ring. I think Elden Ring has more rich, detailed lore that allows us to ask more questions and really think about the lore, but I almost like that Dark Souls kind of has this compact package where there are mysteries, but you're able to solve them. Elden Ring consistently gives us mystery after mystery after mystery, which is fun to speculate about, but Dark Souls gives us a little bit more of a complete package, or at least something that we could come to reasonable conclusions about, and that's something I really enjoy. Just the dark fantasy setting overall compared to Elden Ring's more I don't know if I would call it high fantasy, but it's a little bit more like mystical and fantastical compared to the very dark, gritty nature of Dark Souls, which I enjoyed. Alongside this is going to be graphics. The graphics aren't fantastic, of course. This game came out a long time ago, but I think that the art direction and style hold up exceptionally well, and that it's certainly pleasant to look at, especially when you're in areas like Firelink Shrine or Anor Londo that just feel good to be in. Moving on to some of the more gameplay-oriented things that I noticed, I thought that the attacks felt really good to use. A lot of the weapons that I picked up and used, which were mostly swords, because I like swords, had light attacks that would go into the heavy attacks in a very smooth and transitionary way, and it just felt satisfying to do that. Now, the attacks overall felt sluggish compared to Elden Ring, especially with weapons like greatswords. I started off trying to use a greatsword because sometimes I like to use greatswords in Elden Ring, and to me it felt like swinging around this giant heavy slab of metal that shouldn't nearly be that much weight or should be that slow. And this is something that we say in Elden Ring, but it's even more exemplified when you go back to Dark Souls and you feel how heavy these weapons feel. And that's why I personally switched to just using a little straight sword, because I thought it was more satisfying to actually be able to slash my weapon and hit the bosses as I liked. Another gameplay thing I noticed was that upgrading armor was something that was in this game and felt, to me, good, because upgrading armor made it feel like any armor that you found and liked could be viable for the end game if you upgraded it enough. Something that I really didn't like about Elden Ring was there was a lot of these sets that were kind of nice for fashion, but their defense was so terrible and low that I never felt it was viable to actually use them once you got to the later half of the game where everything practically 1 or 2 shots you. But in Dark Souls, it didn't feel like this. Like, I could find an armor set that I thought was interesting or looks good, and then go and farm and get the resources to upgrade it, and it would be perfectly viable. Bosses are something that I really enjoyed in Dark Souls 1, and it's not something that I can say that I enjoyed more than Elden Ring, because I think Elden Ring has some really fantastic bosses with design, and naturally, the boss design is going to evolve as they make more of these games and they get more experienced. But something that I did notice that I really liked about Dark Souls boss design is that they felt like you could adapt to them, or that you could beat them in one attempt if you were really patient and you were observant. And that's something that I really don't feel like happens too much in Elden Ring. Like, think back to your first time playing Elden Ring, not replaying it now, but your first time playing Elden Ring. How many times were you able to go into a boss and beat them on your first attempt if you weren't really over leveled or you had grinded for a long time? And I think, to me, that exemplifies the fact that the bosses feel very rush downy. They feel very aggressive in Elden Ring. Where in Dark Souls, they have an aggressiveness to them, but also after they attack, they have these periods where you can punish them for doing their attack. Like, you get to have your turn. And that's something that I didn't really feel like in Elden Ring. In Elden Ring, it felt more like you had to find your turn during their turn. And I can't say which of these is better, but I can say that it did feel good to not feel like I had to constantly be on the very top of my game just to get one hit in while playing Dark Souls. Covenants are also something that I think I really enjoyed, and I'm sad that they didn't bring into Elden Ring. They really gave you an incentive to either go PvP or do co-op and just unlock new and exciting things for engaging in the multiplayer of the game. Now, I do think it's kind of annoying that if you want to level these covenants now, it's a lot more difficult because you need to play online, and finding people online to play with is much harder. You can also go and level these covenants by farming an item, but it comes from different mobs and they have a 2% drop rate and you need 30. So just leveling the covenants takes a long time. I don't know if they could reduce the amount of things that you need to level these covenants past when the game is kind of past its prime, or how they would want to do that. But I think there needs to be some sort of small tweak to make covenants less annoying. I didn't get great lightning spear on my playthrough just because I didn't want to farm the sunlight covenant, even though I knew it would be very beneficial for my build. The last thing that I really liked about Dark Souls 1 was the soundtrack, and I think Dark Souls 1 has the best Souls game soundtrack by a good margin. Elden Ring has a fantastic soundtrack, but there's so many bosses, there's so many enemies that, by its very nature, some of these songs are gonna be forgettable. You remember Radagon's theme, and you remember some of the other themes when you're fighting Estelle, but you're not really going to remember a lot of those more minor boss themes. Do you remember the theme that plays when you're fighting the Red Wolf of Radagon? Probably not. But in Dark Souls, almost every single boss you go in to fight, you're going to have some sort of recognizable theme, and it's going to stand out, and they're just very iconic. So I think that Dark Souls 1 has the most iconic soundtrack of the series, and every track associated with every major boss feels memorable. Now we move on to things that I noticed but didn't have a strong opinion about. Something that immediately stood out to me is that the game isn't nearly as hard as I remember it being. And I don't know if that's just because I have so much game knowledge about Souls games and I've played through Elden Ring, which is by its very nature a harder game. But to me, just in general, the numbers felt much more forgiving. If I hit enemies, it felt like I did a substantial amount of damage. And if they hit me, it felt like they did damage, but it wasn't enough to just completely destroy my character in 1 to 2 hits. I really just think that Dark Souls 1 is very well balanced, and that if you are upgrading your weapons and armor, you're going to have a much easier time with this game, and you're not really going to struggle that much. Like I mentioned earlier, bosses have their turn and you get yours afterwards. And when you do get your turn, it feels like you get a chance to do substantial damage. You only have to guess right 5 to 7 times on average to be beating bosses in Dark Souls. Whereas in Elden Ring, if your weapon's a little underleveled or you're not using an optimal build, you're going to be having a long and frustrating fight with some of the bosses, especially some of these DLC bosses that are really tanky and in return will kill you in one shot. Whereas in Dark Souls, it doesn't feel like it's that uneven between you and the boss. Related to this is the idea that armor is just good in general. If you find the Havel set, put it on, you can face tank almost any boss without even having to think about healing or rolling. You can just walk up to them and swing your weapon and you're not going to have that much of a problem, because the defense in this game is really strong and good. So if you upgrade better armor sets, you're going to feel practically invincible to some of these bosses who can barely even hurt you. You can literally just sit there, drink your Estus while you're being attacked because you have enough poise to get through it and not struggle. And I think that's something that is an interesting way to play the game. You have that option in this game compared to Elden Ring, where you don't have that option because every boss staggers you and deletes 75% of your health. I want to talk a little bit about the pacing of this game too. Now, this is something that I mentioned earlier, like I like linear design more, but I also just really like having a direction to move in, and this is something that's going to be preference based. As I mentioned in one of my previous videos, I'm an objective focused gamer, meaning I like to work towards something and complete something. So if you're not like me and you're like someone who wants to explore more or just enjoys deep diving into all the different little areas around you and things that you can find out and you want to go down every route, you might enjoy Elden Ring's open world a little bit more. But I liked that Dark Souls essentially boiled down to ring bells, get Lord Vessel, get Lord Souls, become Lord. Like you had one objective after the other, and that was something that motivated me to get through the game and kept me going even when things felt difficult. In Elden Ring, I'm not a huge fan of the fact that invasions are something that really only happens to people who are currently doing co-op. I like that Dark Souls 1 had more invasion options. Now, I only found myself getting invaded like twice in my entire playthrough, and it's because I forgot I had humanity on. And it's because I almost never use humanity in Dark Souls 1. I'm so protective of my resources, of my humanity, that why am I ever going to use it? I don't like to use summon, so I never need to get to boss doors as a human. To me, humanities were only a thing to make the bonfires better so I could have more Estus, so I could make the zone easier. It was not something I was using to make my journey through an area easier, and therefore I rarely got invaded. So I don't think that invasions are as much of a big deal as I think we make them out to be in the community, but I do think that we should have Covenant invasions and invasions that are themed around something. Those are the ones that felt the most meaningful. Like I did one or two Dark Moon invasions just for fun while I was doing my playthrough, and it was really awesome. Like it felt good to kind of have that purpose, and it felt good to get a reward for doing something that you wanted to be doing anyways. Magic feels extremely simple in Dark Souls 1, and in fact, the very first time that I ever played Dark Souls 1, I didn't even know there was magic. Like, I literally got into the character creator, selected Swordsman because I thought it looked cool, started the game, and I went through the entire game without ever having one spell, or even knowing that you could use spells. Then later on, I went back and did a sorcerer playthrough, and I played with all the magics, and then this time I played through as a faith character, not necessarily a faith caster, but someone who had faith options available to them. But magic in this game really boils down to faith has heal, lightning bolt, push, and buff, and sorcery has damage, even bigger damage, and buff. So there really isn't too many magic options in this game, and a lot of them are very similar. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It was a good starting point for the series, and it helped really create the identities for each of the schools of magic, where you had sorcery that was kind of damage oriented, and then you had faith that was support oriented, and then you had pyromancy, which was this weird middle ground that also had these kind of buffs. I didn't really touch pyromancy in my playthrough, and I've never done a pyromancy playthrough in general, but I do think that it's nice that these schools of magic feel distinct and they have their own purpose, even if they are simple. A final thing that I noticed and didn't have a really strong opinion about was that the Artorias DLC is actually really short. Like, it's like an hour and a half long, and that's not even if you're trying to like beeline your way through it. I literally got in the DLC, walked to Artorias, beat him in like 2 attempts, walked to the next zone, then was in the Abyss and fighting Manus. Like, it all happened so quick. And I had played through the Artorias DLC like 10 years ago when it first came out. And I think I did it actually last time back in 2022, right before Elden Ring came out. But I just didn't remember how short this DLC was. It's exceptionally short. There's not really a whole ton here. But when you think back to it, DLCs back then were limited in a lot of ways because of the time and development it took to make games like this. And it was a bit of a risk within Dark Souls to work on a DLC. Overall, the Artorias DLC is nice. It's just a lot shorter than I remember it being. Now we move on to the things that I didn't like. There's actually not nearly as many of these as I thought there would be. I really thought that when I came into Dark Souls 1, after playing so much Elden Ring, that everything was going to feel primitive and annoying, but it really wasn't like that. There were a few things that stood out to me. I think the biggest one was the 4-way movement when locked on. I have no idea why this is implemented. This is so annoying when you're trying to fight a boss and you want to roll diagonally towards them when you're locked on and you can't. And it makes punishing bosses so much harder. It becomes a non-issue though once you learn that Dark Souls 1 is much easier to play when you aren't locked on. Like, just lock onto the bosses if you lose track of them or something like that, but for the most part, just don't lock on, swing in the direction that you want to swing, and adapt to that playstyle, and it's going to be just as easy as playing the other game's combat. I do think that that is something that they should have changed in the remaster though. Like, it just completely makes the game much harder for no reason because you have to limit your movement when locked on. Standing completely still while healing is something that I also do not like in Dark Souls 1. In Elden Ring, you can't like run while you're using an Estus, but you can move just a little bit. Like you can dodge an arrow or a small projectile, or you can move just out of the range of a boss's attack. Whereas in Dark Souls, you have to really dedicate to that heal, and it's slow and it takes a lot of time, and it's just something that is kind of frustrating. And I do understand why they did it that way. They wanted you to have to dedicate to that heal. So you got away from a boss, you dodged their attack, they are then in their recovery time, it's now your turn, and you're spending your turn to heal. And in Elden Ring, like I mentioned earlier, there's not really like turns in combat. Like you don't get to punish a boss very often, except with like one attack. You have to be able to heal whenever, or just like run behind something and heal. And that is something that was a necessity because of the speed of Elden Ring, whereas because Dark Souls is a much slower game, you therefore have to be much more deliberate and dedicated with when you're going to use these Estus flasks, but it is something that just felt bad to use going back and replaying. NPC quest lines felt kind of annoying and very difficult to interpret where you were supposed to go and how you were supposed to figure something out. Like they didn't always give you a hint as to where they were going to be, but a lot of the times you were able to stumble across them anyway because they usually put them in places that weren't too out of the way. One of the annoying ones is Big Hat Logan. He's kind of in a jail cell, and every time I run into that area, I look at it and then I almost miss him just because he blends in very much with the cage in the cell that he's in. And just a lot of the NPC placements and quest lines in general were just not something that I really meshed with. I thought Elden Ring did it annoyingly as well, but Dark Souls had it in such a way where I didn't feel motivated to do them unless they were directly tied to the items that I needed to get, like spells, faith, sorcery, those sorts of things. And I wasn't really going to waste my time going and doing them if I wasn't going to get some sort of benefit out of that. The biggest thing that I think Elden Ring spoiled us with is the Stakes of Marika, in that I don't like bonfire runs at all to boss rooms. Now, I think that bonfire runs and distance between bonfires is good for the dungeon portion of an area. Like you're exploring and you have to get through it, then you have to get to the end and find another checkpoint, and it's this long trek and journey and you have to manage your resources to get through it. That's something I think is fine. I don't like when you have a long trek and journey through an area and then you have to fight the boss immediately. I much prefer when we have some sort of checkpoint before the boss. I think it would be fine if it was something that was done occasionally, but almost every single major boss in the original Dark Souls has a lot of distance between a bonfire and them and a lot of enemies. The biggest example of this by far is Four Kings, where you have like a 3-minute journey to get to the boss from the closest bonfire. And it's just a pain. I think it's something that was appropriate for the time, and it really helped exemplify why Dark Souls was a difficult game. But I think Elden Ring made the correct decision in allowing us to have these checkpoints before bosses so we could reattempt them. An extension of this is the second half of the game, which, as many have said, is much less tailored and developed than the first half of the game. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because you can go watch a ton of 3-hour video essays that are discussing the second half of Dark Souls and why it's not as good as the first half. But to me, the thing that really stood out the most is that they inflated the difficulty by increasing the distance between bonfires and the major bosses that you needed to fight. Four Kings, Seath, Nito. There's just these big, long, annoying treks to get to them. And if you die, you have to redo everything to get there. And it's just a lot of wasted time. And I don't enjoy it when a game feels like it's wasting my time. Challenge is good. Difficulty is good. Time wasting is not. Because, and I say this because you can run past all of these things. Like, you don't have to fight them. When I go and fight Seath, I'm not fighting all the clams and all the rock monsters and the moonlight butterflies. I'm running past them to get to the boss. So it explicitly becomes a time waste instead of something that actually adds difficulty to the game. When it comes to spell casting, I think I prefer Elden Ring's style of mana. The older Souls games use the style where you slot a spell and then you get a very specific number of casts for it. And this isn't a terrible idea, it functions fine, but I prefer mana where you have to really decide which of the spells and resources you want to be using more of. Like, you have a total pool of a resource that allows you to decide which spells need to be used and when, and I think that's just more satisfying and meaningful to use for me. But this isn't like a huge complaint. I think it's perfectly functional and viable, and they give you enough spell uses. There are some weird ones, like with Gravelord Sword Dance, it says you get 40 uses, but each use uses 20, so you actually only get 2 uses, and I'm not sure why they did it that way. That felt kind of weird. But either way, spells are okay in this manner. I just don't think I prefer it as much as mana. Finally, I have one last thing that I want to talk about that I think was annoying, and this is something that is personally annoying and not something that's actually meaningful to the game, and that is Manus. This boss is so cool. It has great design, it has great attacks, it's very fun to fight, but it is stupidly resistant to magic damage. When I went in there with my maxed out occult longsword, I was doing like no damage. It took me like 10 attempts to beat Manus just because my attacks were doing absolutely nothing, and I was playing a faith build. And if you're playing a caster or a faith build, they just for some reason decided that Manus was going to be a super hard boss for you, and that it's going to be a super easy boss for physical builds. Now they do give you the silver pendant, which makes it really easy to block his annoying magic attacks, but the average player who's playing the Artorias DLC for the first time probably isn't even going to know what that is or how to get it, because it's exceptionally hidden behind an invisible wall that requires a light source to get in a very like off portion of the DLC. I don't know. I just think that Manus was a weird mix of such a cool boss design with great attacks who felt satisfying to fight, but was just really, really annoying to fight as a faith build. And I really think that, I don't know, if they just lowered his magical resistances by like 10 to 20%, it would be a lot less egregious and annoying to fight. Overall, I think Dark Souls 1 holds up really well. Between the art style, the world design, the music, boss design, level design in general, all of these things are exceptional and, in my opinion, timeless. They're the reasons that Dark Souls 1 is always going to be remembered as a legendary game. These things feel good to play even now, 13 years later after the game has come out. I think if you go back and play Dark Souls 1 now, even after playing Elden Ring, you're still going to have a good time. Or if you haven't played Dark Souls 1 or Elden Ring, if you came in as a new player in the modern gaming era, you're still going to have an enjoyable experience, even if it feels a little bit dated. But I want to know below, what are your thoughts on Dark Souls 1? Have you played a lot of Elden Ring, and have you gone back and played Dark Souls 1 since then? Have your opinions changed? Do you agree with some of the things that I've said in this video, or do you think that you have different thoughts? This is the end of our journey with Dark Souls 1, but it is not the end of our journey with Dark Souls. Thanks for watching.
One day, you will stand before its decrepit gate without really knowing why. For that is your fate. The fate of the cursed.